is Audible.
Sounds True presents Mapping Cloud 9, Neuroscience, Flow, and the Upper Possibility Space of Human Experience with best-selling author and journalist Steven Kotler. And now Session 1, the actualization of self-actualization.
Hello. Welcome to Mapping Cloud 9, Neuroscience, Flow, and the Upper Possibility Space of Human Experience. I'm Steven Kotler. I'm the author. I'm going to be your host for the next few hours talking this through. And in my mind, when I think about what this book is about, I often think about it as the science of spirituality meets the science of high performance on a dark and stormy night. And what I mean by that is we are going to back up both the science of spirituality and the science of high performance to kind of their modern origin, which is right after the 1870s. And we're going to peel back the hood on what I think is one of the greatest kind of scientific adventure stories of all time. And the tale spans a couple hundred years, where the upper possibility space of human experience. And when I use that phrase denotes a whole range of experiences, starting with states of awe, flow states, meditative states, trance states, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, speaking in tongues, and so forth. And, of course, contemplative feelings and compassion, ecstasy, those kinds of emotions. This is all the upper possibility space of human experience. And over the past 150 years, science mapped it for the very, very first time. And it was actually twin sciences that mapped it. One branch came out of the science of high performance. The other branch came out of the science of spirituality. And we're going to see how these two ideas started out together, broke apart, and have come back together. Along the way is we're going to see almost everything we thought about human performance, about human possibility, and about religion, mysticism, and spirituality overturned. All of our ideas, what we thought was going on under the hood of all these things, was overturned over the past 150 years. This has massive ramifications from everything from the study of consciousness to the meaning of life. And along the way, we're going to probe and kind of the intersection of peak performance and spirituality. What I'm going to try to do is separate fact from fiction, right? We're going to start the birth of fields like psychology and neuroscience back in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and we're going to walk up to where we are today. And along the way, we're going to decode some very peculiar, very interesting, and very powerful so-called mystical phenomenon. And along the way, I am probably going to sound incredibly reductive. Reductive is a term scientists use, and it means reducing things down to their simplest parts. And it was an idea that really sort of caught fire post-Darwin, when psychologists, philosophers, early neuroscientists really wanted to kind of reduce everything to biological instincts and build up from there. I want to say that I think this is a very important way of looking at phenomenon, but just because I'm reducing something to its bare essence, I'm only talking about one scale of reality, right? So I will be talking about things that are going on in the brain and the body. There are scales above this. We can go off into the astrological scales, much bigger phenomena going on. And there are scales way below this, down into the quantum fields and into the information fields. I'm not going to try to reduce things into those other areas. I am just talking about this particular branch of reality, which is to say, I'm not giving you the full picture. I am giving you what we know, what we can point at and say, this is true. And what we really mean by that is this is true right now based on everything we know up to here. And I'm not going to try to extrapolate into those other domains where we don't have as much understanding. So I'm being reductive, but I am not saying there isn't more mystery out there. There is more mystery out there, but I'm just trying to keep the mystery in the mystery. The point I think we're going to make along the way is that a spiritual path is not unlike a high performance path. In fact, I'm going to argue that even though the language is the same, they're complementary overlapping paths. And from a neurobiological perspective, they're actually the exact same path. So learning about high performance can aid you on a spiritual quest, and learning about spirituality can aid you on a high performance quest. So that's sort of a big picture look at what we're going to be doing over the next couple of hours. So welcome to Mapping Cloud 9. And along the way, just want to give you a little taste of what's in it for you guys, right? Why do you want to just go with me on this ride unless the subject is really keenly interesting to you? One, you're going to come out the other side with a really good sense of the language that scientists use to talk about experiences that you've probably had, that you're probably curious about, that you probably want to learn more about. And a lot of the knowledge of a field is often tucked inside of its technical language. So by breaking down some of the language and just giving you a little bit of familiarity, you're going to have a better vocabulary for understanding what you're experiencing in your own life. We're also going to walk through the history, right? Like what we're doing over the next 8 hours is Nietzsche to now. We're going to start in 1870 with sort of the birth of Nietzsche, I think of as the first high-performance philosopher. We'll talk about why, and we're going to go to now. And the reason this is so great, this kind of historical overview of the modern era, is your brain loves narrative. It is a machine built to do pattern recognition, to hunt cause and effect. So we're built to understand story. So if I can walk you through this big overarching 100-year modern history of science and consciousness and the science of spirituality, et cetera, it's like having a giant Christmas tree. And all the facts that come along are the little ornaments, but I'm giving you the big Christmas tree. If you can understand the language of a subject and its history, that is usually enough to start thinking inside that subject, right? And so this new framework for thinking about spirituality and high performance is going to unlock a lot of possibility in your life. And we're going to talk a lot about sort of hacking consciousness and hacking flow. And by the way, when I use the term hacking, first of all, I'm not using it in a negative connotation. Second of all, I do not mean a shortcut. A lot of people use hacking to talk about a shortcut. In both the path of high performance and the path of spirituality, as far as I can tell, there are no shortcuts. There are paths where you'll waste a lot of time because you're not in alignment with your biology and your neurobiology. When I'm talking about hacking, what I'm often saying is, hey, if we can understand mechanism, if we can understand how the body and the brain produce this particular experience, we can get more of it or less of it. We have some abilities, some power that we didn't have beforehand. So I'm going to be talking a lot about hacking consciousness and hacking performance and even hacking spirituality. I am not saying there's a shortcut here. What I am saying is if you can understand mechanism, you can go A to B faster. Right? And hopefully on the back end of this, you're going to get a sense of where the mysteries still lie, where are there more questions, and places where you really can make a contribution. And that's going to be important, and I'll talk about why in a little bit. But first, I sort of wanted to jump in. This story and the story we're going to be telling, for me personally, it started a lot of different places. One of the places it started was in the early 1990s. And I became a journalist back in the early 1990s. And back then, action sports, surfing, skiing, rock climbing, snowboarding, and the like, they were really hot topics. So this meant if you were a writer or a journalist and you could write and ski or write and climb or write and surf, there was work. I couldn't do any of those things really well, but I was desperate in need of the work. And so I lied to my editors, and I was lucky enough to spend the better portion of about 10 years chasing professional athletes, mostly professional extreme athletes, what we called extreme and what we now call action adventure sport athletes, around mountains and across oceans. And I will tell you that if you are not a professional athlete and you spend all your time chasing professional athletes around mountains and across oceans, you are going to break things. I broke a lot of things. By the time it was all said and done, it was something around 80 bones. That was the total. When you break that many bones, you end up taking a lot of time off. So what would happen, I'd be hanging out, I'd snap this or that, and I'd have to take 3 or 4 or 5 months off. And when I would come back, the progress I saw was mind-boggling. It didn't make any sense. Stuff that had been considered absolutely impossible, never been done, never gonna be done, just 4 or 5 months ago, wasn't just being done, it was being iterated upon. And I want to give you 3 examples of what I saw happening, because what I was actually witnessing was nearly exponential growth in ultimate human performance. Now, ultimate human performance is technically defined as performance when life or limb is on the line. And from an evolutionary perspective, it should be the slowest growth category, right? It should not explode at any one particular point in time, and yet this was happening. And let me give you a couple examples. Easy one is snowboarding. So in 1996, the biggest gap jump anybody had ever cleared on a snowboard was the Baker Road Gap in Mountain, Washington. And the Baker Road Gap is big. It's built over a highway, and it's 40 feet. So snowboarders were essentially jumping 2 buses stacked back to back in 1996. And that was huge and really, really big. And people thought you could edge it up, maybe go 60 feet or 80 feet. It was then believed that above 80 feet, no human being could land. Couldn't do it on skis, couldn't do it on a snowboard, just wasn't actually possible. Well, here we are, less than 2 decades later, and snowboarders can now clear almost 300 feet worth of a gap jump. So we have gone in less than 2 decades from jumping 2 buses to jumping a skyscraper. Surfing is another example. This is a 1,000-year-old sport. And from 400 AD until 1992, progress had been really slow. 25 feet was the biggest wave anybody had ever surfed. There are actually physics papers written about how you cannot paddle into a wave over 25 feet. And it's really simple. The waves just move too fast to paddle into. Well, today, surfers are routinely paddling into waves that are 60, 80, 100 feet big, right? This is nearly exponential growth in ultimate human performance. I'm going to tell you my favorite story of this because it's still amazing to me. So in 2012, a rock climber named Alex Honnold free soloed Half Dome. Now, Half Dome is in Yosemite in California, and it is a huge wall. It takes most climbers a day and a half, and they climb in pairs, and they bring ropes, and they bring equipment, and they bring gear, and they bring portaledges, and they sleep on the side of the wall, and it's a big production. In 2012, Alex Honnold free soloed Half Dome. Free solo means he climbed without rope. He climbed out without protection. If he fell, he died. That simple. He climbed Half Dome in 1 hour and 22 minutes. It is the rough equivalent of running a 4-minute mile in 43 seconds, right? So back then, when I was watching all this happen, it was weirder than it sounds, even though it sounds really strange, because these were my friends. These weren't strangers I was reading about in magazines or watching on television. These were guys I was drinking with. You know, you'd go out in the evening, you'd have a couple beers with Shane, and you'd go out the next morning, and Shane would do something nobody in the history of the world had ever done before and didn't look possible. And that really spun my head around. I want to know what the hell was going on. But more importantly, and this isn't the case now, but back in the early 1990s, action and adventure sport athletes were a really rowdy, irreverent, punk rock group of people with very few natural advantages. So most of the people I knew came from really broken homes, had horrific childhoods. Many of them single-parent homes, sometimes no parents, very little education as well, and almost no money. And yet here these people were reinventing what was possible for our species on a semi-regular basis. And I wanted to know what the hell was going on. But I had also broken 82 bones, and I knew if I didn't take my question out of action sports, I was going to die. I was going to kill myself along the way. So that's essentially what I did. And I have written essentially 10 books about what I discovered along the way. And I've looked at this question of what does it take to do the impossible? So high performance, the peak of high performance. We're talking about the science of high performance. That's one of the lineages. This was my introduction to that science. And I looked at it first in action sports very deeply. But then, for example, my book Tomorrowland is an investigation. I spent roughly 20 years investigating those maverick scientists who took science fiction ideas and turned them into science fact technology. So whether this was the invention of the flying car or the very first bionic eye, the artificial vision system that was ever turned on, or the very first private space launch, or on and on. In my book, Bold, I looked at really maverick businessmen, Larry Page, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Richard Branson, people who have built world-changing companies, often in areas where people didn't even think you could start a company, right? When Richard Branson started Virgin Airlines, everybody said it was a horrific idea, that there was no room in the airlines for his ideas, on and on and on and on. So impossible business feats. In Abundance, where I teamed up with my friend Peter Diamandis, the founder of the X Prize and the co-founder of Singularity University in Silicon Valley, where they study the application of exponentially accelerating technology to solving the world's grand challenges. And we wrote a book called Abundance about individuals and small teams of people going after impossible global challenges: poverty, healthcare, energy scarcity, those sorts of questions, water shortages, and individuals succeeding where 20 years ago, large corporations and big governments who were the only people going after these problems were actually failing. And everywhere I went, I asked the question of, how is this possible? What are we seeing? And one of the answers, and it's going to be an answer that we're going to spend a lot of time on, so I want to start here to just give you a definition and a look at what we're talking about. Whenever you see the impossible become possible, you see a state of consciousness known to researchers as flow. And I want to define flow for you, and this is not my definition. This is a technical scientific definition. It was originally coined by a man named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. We're going to talk more about him later, but it is defined as an optimal state of consciousness. It is a state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. More specifically, we've all had this experience. It refers to those moments of rapt attention and total absorption. We get so focused on the task at hand that everything else just disappears, right? Our concentration gets so intense in the right here, right now, that action and awareness will start to merge. Time will pass strangely. The technical term for this is time dilation. What that means is sometimes, occasionally, it'll slow down. You get that freeze frame effect from anybody who's been in a car crash or seen The Matrix, right? What they now call bullet time. More frequently, much more commonly, time speeds up and 5 hours go by in like 5 minutes. And this is the experience we've all had when you sit down to write that quickie email, right? And you look up an hour later and you realize you've written a long essay. That's a light grade micro flow state, but that's just a taste of sort of time dilation. Sense of self disappears as well. And our inner critic, that nagging, always on defeatist voice in our head, goes very, very silent in flow. Now, when we talk about flow, and I will be talking about it extensively later on, this is exactly what I'm talking about. And underneath everything I'm describing, there is a very precise physiological and neurobiological signature. So physiological, there's what's going on in the body. So what's your heart doing? What's your skin doing? Those kinds of responses, right? Galvanic skin response, which is basically sweating. It's a fear response. That's a physiological signal. Neurobiological signals, EEG, fMRI, so anything that measures brain waves or brain activity, those are the things that I'm talking about here. And so a lot of what we're going to do over the next 6 to 8 hours, right, when we walk through this voyage of discovery where people literally sort of mapped human consciousness for the very first time scientifically. Obviously, in Eastern traditions, they have been mapping human consciousness from a different perspective for thousands of years, and there are obviously Western magical traditions, mystical traditions where the same thing has been going on. But scientifically, it's the past 150 years. And flow was a huge key. And you'll understand why as we go along. But the most important thing to know is while flow is a state of consciousness that is really, really well defined physiologically, neurobiologically, psychologically. In fact, psychologically, this is the core definition that is used when we define flow. So when psychologists and scientists talk about flow, they're talking about the neurobiological signature and the psychological signature, but the state has core psychological characteristics. And I listed a bunch of these for you a second ago. Uninterrupted concentration in the present moment, the vanishing of self, time passing strangely, Loss of bodily awareness is another one. An increased sense of control, that I have more impact over events, and so forth. There were 10 of them originally. This is shrunk down to 7 now, and there are 5 or 6 extremely well-established psychometric instruments that measure these characteristics. So when I talk about flow, I'm talking about something that's very specifically psychological, neurobiological, and physiological. But until the 1950s, and we'll come back to this story later, everybody thought flow was a mystical experience. In fact, they thought it was an experience only spiritual and religious people got to have. So when I say that the science of spirituality and the science of high performance started out together, this is what I mean. We now define flow as a state of ultimate human performance, right? It's different from a spiritual peak state in how we think about it. But 100 years ago, it wasn't. We thought they were the same thing. And we'll talk about what's different, what's the same. We'll go into all of this. But when we talk about the science of spirituality and the science of high performance on a dark and stormy night, this is what I mean. It was all mashed together, and we just didn't know. And finally, before we sort of jump into the sort of the core text of the heart of Mapping Cloud 9, I want to talk a little bit about why I wrote this book and where it came from. I have a little bit of an agenda, and I like to be transparent about my agenda. And the first thing I want you to know is that as a writer, I'm trained as a new journalist, and this is a very specific approach to the truth. New journalism emerged in the late 50s and 1960s. It's writers like Joan Didion, Hunter S. Thompson, John McPhee. And the idea here is really simple, but it's kind of important to our project, which is that coming out of the 50s, it was really clear to a lot of like newspaper writers and magazine writers that in the editing process, truth was getting fucked with. We were messing with the truth. It wasn't like Noam Chomsky and his big conspiracy theories. This was, hey, I'm the writer. I choose fact A and B over C and D. And my editor comes along and he likes A more than B, so he asks me to develop A, and things get cut out. And then there's a top editor on top of that, and then there's an editor-in-chief and a publisher and so forth. And what happens is the truth gets distorted. So new journalists fought back by putting so much of themselves in the story, you always knew where they were coming from. So you always knew what their biases were. So you always knew why they were selecting the facts they were selecting. That was the whole point. So I am a new journalist, which means I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and where I'm coming from in a second. The other thing I want to tell you is I want to talk a little bit about what I call a truth filter. So a truth filter is, how do I know something I'm telling you is true? So as a reporter, the standard truth filter is, if I've got a fact and I can get 3 experts to support my fact, good deal. I can publish it. Excellent. True story, and we're going to hear about this research a little bit later. Years ago, I was writing a story on the neuroscience of out-of-body and near-death experiences, and I was stunned by how much science had actually discovered about these experiences. And we're going to walk through that later, and you'll get to share in this excitement. But at the time, I was like, how the hell is this not common knowledge? Why doesn't everybody know this? And so I started asking the scientists I was interviewing. And the guy I was talking to said, oh, the problem was these 2 people, person X and person Y, wrote these really popular books on it, and they're not really scientific, and they sort of ruined it for the rest of us. And I went, oh, okay, that's great. And I fact-checked this particular fact with 3 other experts, and they gave me the exact same name for X and the exact same name for Y. So I had initial fact, and I had 3 confirmations, and fantastic, and we published it. And it turns out every single person who gave me this fact got the name of one of the book authors wrong. And instead of giving me the name of the correct book author who had wrote a very popular book on the pseudoscience of out-of-body experience, they gave me Charles Tart's name. Charles Tart is one of the most vaunted, lauded, altered state scientific researchers ever. And they got everything wrong. Literally everything they told me they got wrong. And the magazine got a very angry phone call from Mr. Tart. And I was very, very apologetic. And from that moment on, I realized that was not good enough. So every fact in here has been checked with a minimum of 5 people. And I will tell you something interesting, by the way, if you ever want to play this game. I have found that if you ask 5 people if a particular fact is true, 4 will usually say yes, and the 5th person will actually tend to tell you something that contradicts what the previous 4 have told you, and then you have to start over and talk to 5 more. But that's my truth filter. So everything we're going to be talking about today, so you know how accurate I want it to be, that's how I'm applying it. I also want you, as a new journalist, to know a little bit about where I'm coming from, who I am. I'm good at my job because I'm a very frustrated seeker. When I was 19 years old, I dropped out of college, moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, because the New Age was booming. And over the next X amount of years, there was shamans and crystals and ashrams and monasteries and astrology and tarot and psychedelics and more psychedelics. And by the time it was all said and done, I could sit in the full lotus for 6 to 8 hours at a time. I could chant in Sanskrit for 4 or 5 hours at a time. And I never once had a mystical experience of any kind. Nothing interesting ever happened to me. And I was such a frustrated seeker that I spun it around and I went into the science of spiritual experience and mystical experience and flow states, trying to find answers to the questions that I could not find on a spiritual path. So I tend to be a little dismissive of some of the spiritual ideas, and you're going to hear nothing over the next 6 to 8 hours that is going to confirm your belief in Sky Dad. That's not where I'm coming from. But now at least you know why I feel the way I feel, right? And I will also say that even though I am a hardcore science guy, I'm a hardcore science guy who's had a 20-year Ashtanga yoga practice and a 25-year meditation practice. So, and most of that is breath or mantra meditation, though I will say, a friend of mine who's a Tibetan Lama told me that when he first got to Tibet, they locked him in a cave and said, for the next 7 months, I want you to contemplate what it's like to have 11 heads and 1,000 hands. 11 heads so you can see from multiple perspectives, and 1,000 hands so you can help as many people as possible. So I will tell you that I have been trying this particular meditation for the past 8 months, and I can get the head or the hands. I can't get them both at once. So I have a little bit of what you would call a spiritual practice, but as I said, I am not a guy who believes in Sky Dad at all. But I am a guy who believes that the path to peak performance is a spiritual path. And I'm also somebody who cringes when they say a word like spiritual path. So I'm going to spend the next 8 hours sort of proving to you, or at least to myself, that I can use that word out loud and mean something by it. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about my agenda, why I'm doing all this. And the reason I'm doing all this, and especially with Sounds True and this partnership with Sounds True, Sounds True's audience is much more spiritual than the scientists who I deal with on a daily basis or the people I encounter at the Flow Genome Project. And even though I think that in the spiritual community there is very, very sloppy language and very, very sloppy thinking, way, way, way too much, I also know that the field that I am most passionate about, which is studying the science of spirituality and studying the science of human performance, the greatest leaps forward over the past 50 years, maybe the past 150 years, have been when scientists got together with people from the spiritual traditions and we bridged that gap. So a lot of what I'm trying to do over the next 6 to 8 hours is say, hey, there are really big questions out there. There are people with deep spiritual practices who have all kinds of knowledge bases that the scientists are never going to have access to. But if you can't learn a little bit of the language of science, we're never going to listen to what you have to say. So I'm trying to bridge the gap a little bit. I'm extending an olive branch from the science side across the bow, and maybe somebody on the other side will pick it up and advance us a little bit farther for us. And what we're going to do all that in Mapping Cloud 9 is we're going to focus on 5 different transformational epochs. We're going to sort of start with what I think of as the actualization of self-actualization, or this is sort of the era that goes from Friedrich Nietzsche to Carl Jung, where a lot of the foundational ideas about science and the science of spirituality and the science of high performance were laid down for the first time. Then we're going to jump in. The second era is what I call the mystical split. It starts with Abraham Maslow, and this is where science and spirituality actually split apart. And we're going to track the science of high performance sort of from Maslow to now. Then we're going to rewind the clock, going all the way back, and we're going to follow the same trajectory with the science of spirituality. Then we're going to do this a third time with what we can consider sort of a psychedelic detour. Psychedelics are its own funky category. In the beginning, you go back 150 years, and this was spirituality and high performance rolled into one, and then it sort of got split apart, and now today, sort of coming back together. And finally, the last big sort of chapter of this is going to be the Mapping Cloud 9 section, where we talk about the emerging picture of today's upper possibility space. And here, we're going to do a lot of decoding and application. Things are going to get really practical. So we're going to apply some of the spiritual ideas to the science of high performance, and hopefully you'll come out the other side better performers. And we're going to apply the science of high performance to the spiritual pathway, and so hopefully you'll come out the other side with a richer spiritual practice. And the end goal is that you will have a much more interesting, intriguing, and meaningful life on the back end of this. All right, so I want to jump in with Friedrich Nietzsche. So why are we starting this discussion with Friedrich Nietzsche? You probably are familiar with Nietzsche. You probably read Nietzsche back in high school or in college. Nietzsche's a really good point to jump in, because even though philosophy has long sort of concerned itself with questions of high performance and even questions of spirituality, I'm thinking specifically of the Greeks. Stoic philosophy is a really good, early, great kind of high-performance philosophy that's made a big comeback as of lately. But Nietzsche is the first major post-Darwinian philosopher, and that really matters. So 1859, Darwin publishes The Origin of Species, and he brings the entire house of God crumbling down, right? Suddenly, man is no longer created in God's image. Suddenly, man is the byproduct of a random evolutionary process, and we're related to apes, etc., etc. And as a result, Nietzsche's the first kind of post-Darwinian philosopher, and he's part of a growing group of people who went, oh, wow, look, biology evolved, our bodies evolved, I'll bet our brains evolved too. So Nietzsche said, and he says this in his autobiography, he says, who among the philosophers before me was in any way a psychologist? Before me, there was simply no psychology. And what he means is, before me, there was no Darwin. And without Darwin, we didn't know the mind evolved. And because we didn't know the mind evolved in a certain way, we couldn't get a good psychological picture of who we were, who we are, right? And this is also why Nietzsche said, God is dead, right? This is his famous quote. And what he means is he doesn't just mean God is dead, right? He means our big theory ideas about God, capital G, Christianity, Islam, organized religion. But he was also going right at any philosopher who had a perfect world. So Plato's world of forms, right? There's this perfect world of forms that exists out there. It's perfect. Nietzsche was saying, no, it's not. Shut up. Everything is chaotic. Everything evolves. There's no such thing. And he was really pointing at Enlightenment thinkers who thought that the mind of man, aka man and woman, was perfectible. And Nietzsche didn't think this was true at all. Like, he used to talk about Plato. He essentially said Plato was not a big fan of Christianity, as we know, and Nietzsche used to call Plato Christianity for highbrows. So he was really opposed to any of these perfect world systems. Nietzsche thought man was a mess, right? That we weren't evolving in a specific direction, that evolution was random and chance played a role, right? And the thing here that matters is before Nietzsche, right, before Darwin, meaning, purpose in life came from God. Now it has to come from human beings. And this is huge, huge for Nietzsche. Now, a couple other things that Nietzsche thought that are really important, and these ideas are going to come back again and again and again in different forms over the course of our story. So one of Nietzsche's is the first in a long line of thinkers who thought culture weighs too much. Right? Freud is probably the most famous of these thinkers. Freud's big idea was, look, mommy weighs a ton, culture weighs a ton. It is really hard to get out from under this stuff. But Nietzsche felt the same way. And when we talk about the weight of culture, the weight of history, and the weight of mommy, we're talking about at an unconscious level, right? At a really deep unconscious level. And this is how it evolves, right? This is Freud's unconsciousness with all its complexes. This is Jung and his archetypes. This is Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist, structural anthropologist, and his deep structures. Noam Chomsky's universal grammar, Jacques Derrida, the postmodern philosopher, his position on language, which plays such a role in today's social justice issues, right? And let me explain what I mean by this. So culture weighs too much and we can't get away from it, and it's built in unconsciously. So Derrida argues about language, and this is one of the most mysterious, obfuscated arguments, but what he's saying is actually really simple and precise. He's saying, look, language is synchronic and diachronic. Synchronic means the position of a word at a particular point in time in a current linguistic system it's occupying, meaning a cat is not a dog and it's not a horse, but it's also what we mean by the 21st century of a cat, right? So the definition includes a genus and a species, and it doesn't include, say, things that we used to think about cats 300 years ago that were superstitious, right? So that's the synchronic meaning there's cultural weight inside the language we use to describe reality. So we can't even get past culture when we're trying to describe reality, right? The other problem is diachronic, right? Which is the historical catalog of all the meanings. So if I use the word justice today, right, it means one thing. If I use the word justice 1,000 years ago, it means something else, right? If we use the word justice, in biblical times, it means I can stone my child at the city gates for bad-mouthing mommy and daddy, right? The words mean different things at different times. Culture is buried inside the language. So that was a long, long tangent to get us back to Nietzsche, who basically thought of culture as evolutionary success stories, right? What we think of as culture are just strategies that work. And one of his favorite quotes about this that I love, he said, the past of every form and way of life, of cultures that formerly lay right next to or on top of each other, now flow into us modern souls. Our drives now run back everywhere. We ourselves are a kind of chaos, right? And what he means by we are a kind of chaos is we're an aggregation of intertwined psychological entities. Some of these are unconscious. They're the weight of culture. They're mommy. And some of it are our old ancient instincts, all sort of mashed together into the mess, right? So he doesn't believe we can know everything about our minds. This is really important. He believes in the unconscious, right? And that mommy and culture are heavy there. But the most important thing about Nietzsche is he thought there had to be more going on. He thought we weren't doomed to this, right? And so he wanted to replace the struggle to survival with one of his most misinterpreted terms, the will to power. The will to power has nothing to do with what we think of as power over another human being or power in a political sense. He is talking about unearthing our true nature and overcoming our true nature. The struggle for self-overcoming, the struggle for self-creation, for self-actualization, for excellence, right? What used to be God or these perfect world things is now human beings' duty, right? And so he doesn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, too. He wrote a really great book called Twilight of the Idols, where he said, look, I do philosophy with a hammer. And people thought what Nietzsche meant is I smash things. And he doesn't mean it that way. He means he's going to ring the idols like you would ring a bell. And he's going to see which ones are hollow and which ones have substance. By idols, he means any of the so-called great men. Confucius, Buddha, Moses, Jesus, Plato, Aristotle, right? And what he wants us to do when we think about these people is not think of them as gods, but understand that these were all human beings. So when Jesus was coming up with his ideas, he is a man having brilliant creative insights, exercising his will to power, right? But you have to judge these insights through the lens of science. So when philosophers practice philosophy, in a sense, because the topics are so big and highfalutin, Nietzsche was interested in values and ontology and all these fancy words, they call them, to make it a little more humble, projects. So Nietzsche's project was essentially trying to decode all of these ancient traditions and see what holds up, what doesn't hold up, what makes sense through the lens of science, and what should we look at and say, oh, this is just the culture of the time or the sociology of the time or the politics of the time, and we should strip it out, right? Like in the Jewish dietary laws, nobody looks at the laws of kosher and thinks anymore, this is the word of God. We think, oh wow, in the era before we really could cook, trichinosis was a problem and you shouldn't eat raw pork or you shouldn't eat shellfish, right? Like this is a health idea disguised as a religious idea. So Nietzsche wants to strip all that stuff out and get to the core ideas. So with all that said, the one thing I also want to say is that Nietzsche is sort of a high romantic. And what he means by this is he is, what we would now say about him today is he's spiritual but not religious. He believes, even though that even though he doesn't believe in these perfect worlds, he does believe in this experience of cosmic unity, of becoming one with everything. That's sort of woven through. So there's a mystical current in Nietzsche underneath all this stuff. But as a general rule, Nietzsche had a really simple formula for high performance, and we're going to do this throughout. And this often gets lost. We hear all these really big kind of fancy philosopher names, and we forget that what they're actually trying to do, a lot of them, is just to help us live better lives, right? So there are actual, especially in Nietzsche, there's a high performance formula, and it's really sort of a 4-step formula. And the reason we're going to walk through it is both because I think it's really, really cool and really, really useful, but it's amazing that where we end up 150 years from now, these ideas are still, not only are they incredibly relevant, now they're scientifically validated. That's what's really interesting. And it also means that long before there was any science to back Nietzsche up, right? Long before we had modern neuroscience, modern psychology, modern anything, this dude was right. And it's worth pointing that out. So at the core of what he said is, and this is sort of his recipe for becoming the Übermensch, right? Übermensch was his word for the Superman, right? The Overman. And he didn't think really any one person could do this. He thought this was our project as a species to try to evolve into this, right? And what he said is the place you got to start is you got to find your passion and your purpose. Find an organizing idea. This is what Rilke meant by live the questions, right? Rilke was very influenced by Nietzsche, same era roughly. Live the questions. Find a central organizing idea and then attack it creatively. Nietzsche saw art as fundamental to high performance and as an antidote to nihilism, to world weariness. And he was really concerned about this. Nietzsche pointed out, he said, look, if God is dead and there's no meaning coming from up above and we got to make it for ourselves, this is really hard. This is really hard. And if we don't make it for ourselves, we are going to fall prey to fascists who serve as the new deities. In other words, Nietzsche saw Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini coming 40 years before they showed up. He was dead on right about everything that was about to come. Out of this, right, comes the will to power, which is the great existentialist mandate, right? We take full responsibility for our choices and we act, we create, and we alone bear the responsibility for our creation. Now, art wasn't just the antidote. Creativity, self-expression, self-actualization, self-discovery wasn't just the antidote to nihilism. He loved it so much because art reminds us of what he called states of animal vigor. And he used a very specific term. He used the term Rausch. Now, Rausch is essentially the ancient German term for flow. It originally comes from Goethe, and it means the acceleration of movement leading to a flowing joy. Now, this is interesting because what Goethe and Nietzsche are talking about is a subdued, controllable ecstasy and elation. So this isn't like a possession experience, right, where you are overtaken by spirit and you lose control of yourself. In Rausch, in flow, this is peak performance. You are at your best. But they also talk about it as there's The separation of high and low is erased. This is we are becoming one with everything, right? They also talked about Rausch as the delight of the inner faculties that lead to self-forgetfulness, right? So this is Csikszentmihalyi's The Vanishing of Self as a fundamental definition to flow, just 100 years literally before Csikszentmihalyi came up with the idea. This is also really cool. Nietzsche was the first, by no means the last, to figure out that flow was ethically neutral, right? There is the Rausch of creativity, and then there's the Rausch of destruction. Nietzsche also pointed out, by the way, that flow or Rausch could be accessed chemically under the influence of certain narcotics, and he talked about it as a strength, a vigor, and for there to be art, for there to be any aesthetic doing and seeing, one physiological precondition is indispensable: Rausch. Rausch must first have enhanced the excitability of the whole machine, else there is no art, as Nietzsche said. Now that's his third point. His fourth point, and this is very Nietzsche, but we're going to see it again and again and again and again. And this is a high performance tradition that is necessary in the spiritual community and often gets very overlooked in the spiritual community. So one of the things you're going to see as we go along is oftentimes, because these are similar paths, if you're on a high performance path and you're stuck, you need a spiritual answer. And if you're on a spiritual path and you're stuck, oftentimes you need a high performance answer, right? And one example is here. And for Nietzsche, he felt that suffering is not optional. He felt that the only way out is through, right? He felt that the measure of a really good life was a life spent suffering. He used to write Christmas cards to his friends that would say things like, "Congratulations, I hear you got gout this year and cancer and lost an eye and had your leg amputated. How fantastic for you." Because of everything that you could learn on the other side of that. One of his favorite descriptions of his self, when he was talking about himself, Nietzsche used to say, "I am more of a battlefield than a man," which I love. And he also felt that the only way to kind of move through this suffering, again, was the will to power, right? It's creative self-expression. Overcome yourself, become bigger than you are. Now, the interesting thing here about all this is that Nietzsche also agreed, by the way, with Jung, and we'll see this when we start to talk about Carl Jung a little later. Jung was really clear. He said, yeah, mommy and culture weigh a lot, and you have to overcome them. But after you've overcome them, you got to go right at your darkness, right? Jung called it your shadow side. That's the way forward. Nietzsche absolutely agreed, right? He wrote, and as I said earlier, that Übermensch translates as Superman. So I'm translating out of the German here. And he wrote, "I teach you the Superman. Man is something that should be overcome. What have you done to overcome him?" It's also, with all the fancy language aside, understand all he's saying here, right? What he's saying is passion, purpose, grit, flow. This is the path to high performance. That's really what he's saying. That's how we boil it down. Most importantly, and this is sort of key to Nietzsche, and it shifts back and forth, but it also shows up in a lot of the spiritual traditions. So, give you an example. When I was 18 years old, my first novel is a retelling of an ancient Kabbalistic Jewish story, and a lot of it happened because I went to my rabbi. I was like 17, 18 years old. I was raised Jewish, and I heard about this thing called Kabbalah, and I was intrigued, and I asked my rabbi to explain Kabbalah to me, teach me Kabbalah. And he said, "Well, you're not 40 years old. You're not a Talmud scholar, not a Torah scholar. I will not teach it to you. This is forbidden knowledge." And I said, "Screw the rabbi," and wrote a book about it. So Nietzsche felt the same way as my rabbi. He said high performance is not for everybody. He actually thought less than 10% of the population should actually try high performance. And he was not a fan of most people. He thought most people he thought the herd mentality was prevalent. He called them sheep and cows, right? And there were two types of the herd. There was the last man and the slave, right? The last man is governed by the hunt for short-term pleasure, right? This is the mediocre man who is blind to higher values and is just seeking, this glass of wine and this sexual escapade. and this television program, and I can watch Netflix and blah, blah, blah. So wasn't very impressed with The Last Man. And the other half was The Slave, which he thought was worse. And The Slave was a mentality where you try to bring people down. You burn out the geniuses. Anytime you see somebody expressing your will to power, right? This is the nail that sticks out, gets hammered down kind of idea, right? And if you worship comfort and conformity, the herd wins, right? That you needed that lofty goal to rise above. But again, Nietzsche didn't think everybody was capable, but he thought really just maybe 10% of the population could pull this off. Everybody else, not so much. You're sort of screwed. So Nietzsche kicks off our discussion. He did so at a specific point in time, right? He was doing his early work in the 1870s. And I want to just give you a picture of what else is going on in the world, right? So 1873, 1 year after Nietzsche has published his first major work, which is The Birth of Tragedy, a German physiologist named Wilhelm Wundt publishes Principles of Physiological Psychology, which is a big deal. It establishes the field of experimental psychology, right? So the very thing Nietzsche wanted, a rigorous, experimental, evolutionary-minded approach to the human mind, Wilhelm Wundt gives us. And it's a big deal because up until this moment in time, psychology had been a part of physiology. It wasn't its own field. Wilhelm Wundt breaks it off. And he introduces a notion that's going to show up again and again and again, which is introspection, right? Looking inward to examine our thoughts, our feelings, our consciousness. This becomes phenomenology, right? And after Freud essentially swallows psychology for 30 to 40 years. Phenomenology, right? Phenomenology is a fancy way of saying, how does this make me feel? What's going on inside me? So by looking inward, by introducing introspection, you notice that all he's doing is essentially introducing a very Eastern philosophical, spiritual idea into the Western psychological tradition almost at its root, right? And Wundt's big deal in high performance is he starts, through introspection, he starts breaking apart all the little components, habit, attention, all the things, by the way, that you see in where they talk about in Eastern meditation traditions, suddenly get introduced into the psychology of high performance. And suddenly we're looking at attention. We're trying to study these things and measure them experimentally. And a great example of this, so this was at a time, by the way, when science and industry were not separated at all. So Wundt, one of his early contracts, he's hired by a German beer manufacturer. And the beer manufacturer wants to know, is there a perfect amount of bitterness in beer that everybody's going to love? So if I can get my beer to this perfect amount of bitterness, I've nailed it. So Wundt does a whole bunch of experiments, and what he discovers is what we now know in physiology as the Yerkes-Dodson curve, and this is going to come back later when we talk about the neurobiology of flow. But what he discovers is there's a sweet spot for attention, and that below this sweet spot, there's not enough of a stimulus, aka you're bored, you're not paying enough attention to the thing. So if there's bitter in the beer and you can't really notice it's bitter, it's not having an effect, right? And then there's the sweet spot. It's the perfect amount of bitterness or the perfect amount of whatever sensation. And above that, whoa, way too much. It's anxiety. It's freaking me out. There's too much bitterness. I don't like how this tastes, or I don't like this noise is too loud. In between is a sweet spot. Psychologists now talk about that sweet spot as the flow channel. And it turns out when we get to flow hacking and how to produce this state of consciousness at will, this sweet spot discovered way back when a guy was looking for the perfect bitter beer turns out to be a really big key. So psychology, Nietzsche's doing his work. He's saying, hey, we need a science of spirituality in a sense. We need a science of high performance. It's got to be based on evolution. It's got to be based on experiment. And Wundt comes along and does just that. Now, simultaneously, right, the science of spirituality is getting kicked off, and it's getting kicked off by a guy named Albert Heim. Now, if you've read my book, Rise of Superman, you may be familiar with Heim's story. I want to retell it here because it's so important. The year is 1871, and Heim is a Swiss geologist, and he's going to go on later in his life. He's going to do really foundational work on the geological structure of the Alps, and he's going to be a member of the Oxford Royal Society. Back then, he is still making a name for himself. It's 1871, and he and his brother and 3 friends, and they set out and they're going to climb the Santis, which is the 12th highest peak in Switzerland. Now, all 5 men had been playing in the Alps since they were children, but none of them were considered experienced mountaineers because the issue is historical. No one back then was an experienced mountaineer, right? The first recorded climb in history, mountaineering expedition, belongs to Emperor Hadrian. It's 121 AD, and he scampers up Mount Etna to watch the sunrise, right? The modern birth of mountain climbing is often dated to a guy named Sir Alfred Willis, who in 1854 went up the Wetterhorn. The funny thing, by the way, is that he's not often credited with it. Other people had actually been to the top of that peak, other Germans, but Alfred was an Englishman, and the English were then keeping score. So Willis's contract sort of marks the birth of systematic mountaineering and the birth of what's known as the Golden Age of Alpinism. It's a decade-long stretch where most of the first peaks in the Alps are climbed. Heim doesn't arrive in time for the Golden Age of Alpinism. He's a few years too late, so there are no peak bagging exploits credited his name. In fact, he's not remembered at all for contributing to mountaineering history, but he is remembered as the point that history took a turn for the weird. So Heim is high up on the Santis, and he is trying to cross a snowy ridge, and a blizzard has blown in, and he can no longer see straight, and he's in the middle of this rocky ledge. The way forward is down a dicey slope, steep, it's narrow, there's cliffs on all sides. All of a sudden, all 5 people, they're arguing, they don't know what to do. Should they go forward? Should they go back? Right? And Heim decides he's going to set out, and in the moment he steps forward, the wind blows, pulls his hat off his head. Without trying to think about it, he tries to snatch it back, right? This motion unbalances him, right? And the angle of the perch does the rest. He falls sideways, he flips upside down, he spins around backwards, and before anyone can react, he's rocketing towards the lip of the cliff with no way to slow down. His ice axe's out of reach, right? He tries driving his hands into the ground, but his skull keeps slamming into rocks, his finger gets ground to pulp, and even before the pain can register, he is airborne. And while his actual flight covered 60 feet and lasted a few more seconds, that was not Heim's experience at all. The first thing he had noticed is he had dropped out of normal waking state reality into an entirely other dimension. His senses are heightened. His vision feels panoramic. Time has slowed to an absolute crawl, right? And he can see his brother, he can see his friends, he can see the horrified look on their faces as they see what's going on. But as he later explained, he felt no anxiety, no trace of despair or pain, rather a calm seriousness, a profound acceptance, and a dominant mental quickness. And with his life unfolding in slow motion, Heim has time to survey the entire territory and make rescue plans. He imagines scenarios for slight injuries and serious injuries, and where he's going to land and how he's going to bounce and how his companions are going to get down to his body. And then he thinks, oh, I'll be dead and they won't be able to find my body, and I'll be unable to deliver the lecture I'm supposed to give at Oxford University a few days from now. Oh my God, it's my first major Oxford lecture and they're going to need to find a substitute. And then he says goodbye to his friends and his family, and he's still falling. And then he realizes that if he survives his fall, he's going to need to wake himself up and clear his head. So he's got vinegar for just this purpose in his backpack, in his rucksack. And then, as he later recounted, I heard a dull thud and my fall was over. Heim survived the impact, but the mystery of what happened never left him. Panoramic vision, time dilation, heavenly music, none of it made any sense, right? And he's a scientist by training, so he decides he wants to investigate this. And he does what becomes the first study of near-death experiences ever undertaken, right? And he finds 32 other climbers, all of whom who have survived near-fatal accidents. And a staggering 95% of this study group reported similar weird events, right? What was causing them is going to be a matter of really long debate, but it's the first scientific investigation that determines, first of all, high-risk activity can have a profound impact on consciousness, right, and can improve our mental states, right? He was incredibly clear-headed in his thinking, right? He writes this up in 1892 in a monograph called Remarks on Fatal Falls. And historians still consider it, as I mentioned, the first written account of near-death experiences. But the term is really misleading. A lot of Heim subjects reported these profoundly altered states without actually being in real jeopardy. They only thought they were in life-threatening situations. And that's the key detail, right? If these experiences are mystical, if they only arose in dire straits, right, when our life is on the line, then perhaps they really were communications from beyond the beyond. But if it's perception and psychology that are the triggers, meaning I wasn't actually in a life-threatening situation, I just thought I was in a life situation, then the puzzle is more physiological than paranormal. And that opens the door for a lot of really interesting possibilities. So everything I talk about as the science of spirituality is the exploration of those interesting possibilities. So one of the first to know these possibilities, and one of my great heroes, is the Harvard philosopher, psychologist, and physician William James. So the philosopher Alfred Whitehead once said, there are four great Western thinkers: Plato, Aristotle, Leibniz, and William James. For a long time, he was definitely the most famous psychologist in the